Hello everyone, welcome back again, and I do apologize for the second time if I all of a sudden just started coming in the middle of a sentence. Again, this timing on the software is pretty weird, but hopefully we'll get used to it eventually. So, if you're here right now viewing this, you should have already looked at the role of African states in the growth of the Atlantic slave trade. Today, we're going to take it to the other side and look at the impact of the Atlantic slave trade in the Americas once the slave trade got up and running. So, to start things off for our key terms, we're going to be looking at the infamous Middle Passage. We're going to be looking at the triangular trade and Atlantic trade system. We'll be looking at sugar plantations, the Carolina and Georgia colonies, and a phenomenon called Africa diaspora. Also, again, to start things off as usual, just to remind you all some upcoming assignments, won't spend a ton of time on this because I mentioned these last time. You have your writing assignment, of course, due September the 4th at 5 p.m. By the time you're viewing this, it's probably going to be due pretty soon, so make sure you get this done as soon as possible. Your first content quiz is coming up on September the 11th at 5 p.m., and your final essay thesis statement is due September the 18th, also at 5 p.m. If you have any questions about where to find these assignments or where to turn them in, please, as always, let me know as soon as possible. Sorry my face is covering up Ryan Gosling's face. It's probably a crime against humanity. So, in the meantime, I do want to give you just again a quick example to look to for works cited pages and bibliographies. This is just a quick example of how it should be formatted. Typically, when you see a works cited page, you'll have the author listed first, you'll have the title of the work mentioned next, then you'll have whatever source you got it from. So if it's a book, you'd list the publishing company here. You could list the journal title here, things like that. Give me the volume, the number, all that fun stuff, the publication date, and if it's online, you would give me the URL location. You'll format it in this simple manner. It's always going to be double spaced, and there should always be a hanging indent for every single citation. It's pretty simple. And again, just as a quick reminder, if you check our Moodle course, your citation guides are located right here. They will be here the entire semester. So please, if you haven't already, do take advantage of those. They are there for your benefit and should help you quite a bit. Also, this is a bibliography example. This is if you use Chicago-style citations. Either one should work. Doesn't really matter which one you use. And they're formatted pretty similarly. So again, this is just a quick example you can look at. If you have any questions about this, please do let me know as soon as you possibly can. Because again, like I said, by the time you're viewing this, there's probably not much time left before the writing assignment is due. So you want to make sure you get caught up on that as soon as you can. Again, also, there's just a quick reminder to look at for primary and secondary sources. I won't spend a ton of time on this either because I took a lot of time explaining it last time. But do please keep this in mind and remember that both are required for your writing assignment. Now, in the meantime, if you aren't aware, once slavery reached North America, the primary form it took in many places, and by far the most profitable, was the plantation slavery system. Please, if you have notes on this from last time, review what the plantation system was and what its point was, and then imagine what role slavery is going to play. Because the main thing that's different this time, as I'm going to get into, is that African slaves are now starting to take the place of Native American slaves for reasons we'll get into in just a second. Now, just to give you an idea on the route of the numbers on the Middle Passage, which of course is the name for the sea passage that slaves took to reach South America and North America. Roughly 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the Americas across the slave trade system from roughly 1650 to 1860. Out of that number, 1.4 to 2 million, the numbers vary, died during transportation. A whopping 5.8 million, roughly, of these were sent to Brazil, and most of the remainder were sent to the Caribbean, while some were also sent to North America. So that gives you an idea of just how crazy the numbers were on this Middle Passage. To give you even more detail you probably don't want, but I do believe you need, I do have a video that is here that does a very good job of explaining the conditions on what a slave ship was like, and will help explain why these numbers were so high for how many people died during transportation. So, also, but before we get there, do keep in mind, let me pause this really quick when it pulls up, My apologies, my technology, like I said, is not very nifty or fast. Alright. In the meantime, keep in mind during this, think especially what role sickness played aboard a slave ship, some of the examples of cruelty the slaves suffered while they were being transported, how women were, what positive and negative experiences women had on these ships, and what the significance is of the experience of the trial of the Zong ship crew and captains, which you can see depicted right here. So as you can guess just from this picture, what happened on this ship is obviously not a good thing. So really quick, we'll just go over the experience of a slave ship, and then hopefully you guys can discuss it or get some notes from it, and then we'll move on.
From about 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homeland and forcibly transported across the Atlantic, a journey that approximately 2 million of them would not survive. By the turn of the 18th century, European merchants were building vessels capable of transporting hundreds of enslaved people per journey. These ships had extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Before boarding the ships at African port cities, enslaved people were stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions and had their heads forcibly shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, enslaved people lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch those enslaved who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, enslaved people would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were segregated by gender and age. Adult men were kept separately and shackled in pairs. Women usually left unchained in their designated compartment, and children often free to move about the ship. There were no sanitary facilities of any kind. Enslaved people were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, creating hellish conditions when combined with the heat and lack of ventilation below deck. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, and influenza ravaged the enslaved and crew members alike. The enslaved people generally spent about 8 hours a day above deck, but were still separated by gender, with a barricado, a reinforced wall that could be used to protect crew members in case of a revolt. Enslaved people were also subject to forced exercise, which sometimes included dance and song for the entertainment of the crew. Enslaved captives deemed disobedient were tortured and beaten, usually whipped with the especially cruel cat-o'-nine tails, a tool designed to inflict maximum pain. Enslaved people who refused to eat their typical meal of rice and beans were forced to do so, sometimes with a speculum oris, a medieval tool used to force open a person's mouth. Women, while usually left unshackled, were raped and sexually abused by members of the crew, sometimes arriving in the New World, carrying the children of their attackers. But it was the women, using their minuscule freedoms, who would often coordinate mutinies against their captors. But these rebellions were rarely successful. The true extent of the horrors of the Middle Passage came to light in a 1783 court trial over the slave ship Zong. The Zong left present-day Ghana in August of 1781, with 442 enslaved on board. After a 2-month journey riddled with navigation errors, 62 enslaved people and 7 crew members had perished without reaching their destination. Disease was spreading throughout the ship, and fresh water was running dangerously low. Captain Luke Collingwood was afraid of the financial cost of more deaths. Enslaved people that died of disease were not covered by the ship's insurance, but the enslaved who drowned were. Collingwood ordered approximately 130 enslaved people thrown overboard. He claimed it was necessary to do so to halt the spread of disease. At the trial between the Zong's owners and their insurance company, the owners argued that because it was legal to kill sick animals for the health of a ship, it was legal to treat enslaved people the same. The court agreed with the ship's owners, but the trial itself exposed the horrors aboard the Zong, and its story was republished by British abolitionists with the name of the ship redacted, meant to show that this tragedy could happen on any ship transporting enslaved people across the Middle Passage. 24 years after the Zong trial, the international slave trade was outlawed in both Great Britain and the United States. It would take England an additional 26 years, and the U.S. another 58 years plus a civil war before the practice of slavery was officially abolished.
All right, so there you go. That's just a quick eye-opening, hopefully, video on some of the circumstances that slaves on these slave ships experienced. So again, please keep these issues in mind, and especially keep in mind what they reveal about what the conditions were like on these slave ships, and what the discovery of those experiences with the Zong helped to do for African Americans and the slave trade across the world. Now, in the meantime, another name we give for this trade system that was set up is triangular trade, or the Atlantic system. By the time the slave trade got underway, it was set up between the Americas, Africa, and Europe. It was especially supported by the Navigation Acts of 1651 and 1660, which meant that all goods being shipped to England from America had to be shipped by English vessels. Now, why would they do something like that? Again, awkward pause for people who aren't there, or aren't here with me. Hopefully you're all viewing this at home. Now, as you might guess, it's about the monopoly of profit, essentially. If England gets to have the ships that these goods are shipped on, England is the one who's going to get the lion's share of the profits. So this shows that European countries were very invested in protecting their wealth on this trade system, and they wanted to monopolize it as much as possible. The general setup is very simple. There's, of course, more specifics going on, but this is the gist of it. In Africa, they would ship slaves and precious metals to the Americas and over to Europe occasionally as well. But especially the slaves over time were shipped to the Americas. America would then use those slaves and other laborers to produce raw goods and raw materials, so things like crop, food, and timber would be sent over to Europe. Europe, in the meantime, would use all these raw materials that they're getting from the slaves and the Americas to ship goods to America and Africa. Now, why exactly is it going to be set up like this? Again, question for you to answer on your own at home, hopefully. Now, as you can probably guess, the end result is to get to these manufactured goods right here that are being shipped by the Europeans. The whole thing is set up to give Europeans the access to the raw materials they need to make goods that they can then turn around and sell to the very people who are allowing these things to be produced in the first place. So again, it's all about producing wealth for the European countries that are setting up this colonization system. Now, moving forward, to give you a little bit of an idea of what slavery was like in various places. The plantation economy was first established and very profitable in the Caribbean. Europeans were primarily motivated when they set up these colonies by something called mercantilism. Keep this in mind, it is going to keep coming up as we talk about further colonies. Mercantilism was the belief that a country needed to increase its own wealth, that should be its primary goal, and the way it should do this is to cut off its rivals to enhance its own status. So again, that's another reason why it was so important for England to try to control all of the ships that were being a part of this trade. If they control the trade, they can cut out other European countries and enhance their own status. As we go forward, that's also going to explain why imperialism and colonization was so competitive. The more colonies your country owns, the more superior you can feel and seem to your surrounding countries. And really the more powerful you actually are, because you have more access to these raw materials, which lets you make more stuff. In 1655, for example, England had actually seized Jamaica from Spain, and by 1665, France actually took the western half of Hispaniola from Spain, which would later be known as Saint Domingue, if I'm pronouncing that again correctly. So it shows that these colonies were actually starting conflicts and wars because they wanted to, again, enhance their own wealth and cut everyone else off as much as they possibly could. By 1511 is when most historians credit this plantation system really getting underway, when Spain authorized 50 African slaves to be imported to Hispaniola, to replace the native workforce. This again gives us a bit of a review from last time. You hope you remember the crazy impact that disease had upon Native American populations. Literally the reason this got started was because the native population on Hispaniola and really across the Americas had been decimated by smallpox, so they had to replace their workforce with now African slaves. The sugar plantations were the most dominant form these plantations took in the Caribbean. Sugar plantations were, with really no exaggeration, horrendous. There was actually only a 5 to 6 year life expectancy for slaves that were brought to the Caribbean sugar plantations. A couple of the reasons for this, you can see the working conditions here. They worked outside in terrible heat all day. The refining process of sugar itself was actually very dangerous with all the machinery, and the working hours, as you would probably guess, were pretty much working from sun up to sunset, if not longer. And actually, something else also reveals the cruelty of this system is that there was a low slave price at the time and for protecting the slaves. It was actually cheaper to work slaves to death than to invest in the families. So instead of trying to invest into the slave system to try to keep slaves alive longer and more productive, they didn't even worry about doing that small quote-unquote kindness. They would just work them to death so they could just buy other slaves for a very cheap price. So again, very horrific system that characterized much of the Caribbean. South America also had its share of slavery as well. As I mentioned with the numbers of the African slave trade, this portion was dominated by Brazil, as they got almost half of all of the slaves shipped throughout the entire American hemisphere. Slavery in Brazil is so popular from the 1530s to the 1600s because there was a global rise in demand for sugar. Because of this, more and more slaves were imported to Brazil, because Brazil is one of the greatest sugar producers in the entire world. By 1680, the indigenous slave trade was actually abolished. Why might that be so significant? As you might imagine, again, imaginary class I'm not actually talking to right now. This means, again, the Native American slave trade is winding down so badly that you have to rely even more on African Americans for your slave trade. It got even worse by 1690 when gold was discovered in Minas Gerais, which is a state in modern-day Brazil. So essentially it's like their Georgia of the country of Brazil. It got so extensive that by eventually 2/5 of Brazil's population would consist of people of African descent, and slavery was such an integral part of Brazilian life and the economy that they were actually the last country in the entire Americas to give up slavery. Slavery was not abolished in Brazil until 1888, over 20 years after it was officially abolished in America, for example. Now, of course, we can't leave out what slavery was like in North America either. Now, interestingly, only 3 to 5% of slaves that were shipped to North America. So as you can see here in the numbers map, we really only would get about 0.5 million in the New England area, and roughly 4.5 million were ever even imported to Charleston in the South. So we really did not get that many slaves in comparison to other areas, especially South America. Now, however, slavery was still significant in North America because of procreation. This actually raised the numbers to 4 million plus across just North America by the Civil War. The reason I put procreation in quotes, as we'll get into a little bit more detail in a second, and you would learn more about if you took American History 1 as well, is that obviously, as you might imagine, a lot of this procreation was forced. As I believe I mentioned in this class earlier, that's why slavery heritage was passed down through your mother. Oftentimes, what would honestly happen is slave owners or other people involved in slave trade could rape African women just to make more slaves, and since their mother was a slave, they became a slave as well. But then even among slaves themselves, any children they had with each other, these children would also be slaves. So again, just because of procreations, the slave numbers rose, despite the fact that not many slaves were actually shipped to North America. For a few examples, by 1619, the first African slaves had come to an English colony in Jamestown. This was based on growing tobacco, their cash crop, or the sought weed as they called it, which was imported from the Caribbean and grown in primarily places like South Carolina and Georgia. The Carolina colony, that's us, was actually founded in 1670. The alliance was actually formed with the natives of the area between 1715 and 1770 because Native Americans were revolting against slavery. Because of this, South Carolina split in 1719 so they could start importing African slaves and replace their slave population. This shows that South Carolina, even then, was very dedicated to the practice of slavery and helps to explain why once we get to the Civil War, South Carolina was the very first state to actually leave the Union to protect slavery. This colony was mainly known for producing sugar, rice, and the plant indigo. Georgia came along a little bit later and was actually tragically founded by a guy named James Oglethorpe. He actually originally founded the colony in 1733 to be a slave-free colony and a refuge for poor people and debtors from England. However, because of economic pressures, he eventually was convinced to start a slave cotton-based plantation economy before he died. So Georgia became especially known for producing cotton at that time. So again, as you notice, and hopefully if you remember from the plantation system, most of this slave trade and slave populations in North America and South America are centered around producing some type of cash crop to make everyone a lot of money. Now, the last thing I want to look at before we wrap things up for this week is the effects of something called the African diaspora. African diaspora is a name that sociologists and historians have given to the massive forced migration of African slaves across the Americas and across the world. Because again, remember, massive numbers of people are being shipped all across the world against their will, which means they're obviously going to have an impact that we often don't recognize on these new places they reach. So just a few examples of how slaves affected the culture of America once they got there. Religion is a great example. If you remember from last time, I mentioned that a lot of African kingdoms that brought slaves over to the Americas started acclimating and buying into religious traditions from Europe. This meant that a lot of times slaves would bring all sorts of hybrid religions to the Americas. So, for example, they would bring traditions from Africa, Christianity, and Islam, and have some kind of blending of the three brought into America. One of the main examples you can see this in is the blending of religious symbols. A lot of times slaves would use crucifixes in similar ways that Africans used other symbols to ward off evil spirits. Voodoo was often practiced in the Deep South, especially in Louisiana, where a lot of some North African slaves would be brought. You can see here New Orleans is one of the main ports that received slaves at the time. So that was one of the main places African voodoo was practiced. And also, Christian Catholic saints were often compared to ancestor worship, which actually a fun fact for those of you who didn't pick up on this maybe or weren't taught it in World Civilizations 1. Many historians have argued that the reason Catholicism was originally more successful in converting Africans and Native Americans than Protestant missionaries were is because many of these African and Native religions were good Lord, I can't think of the word off the top of my head. I just had a brain fart. I highly apologize. Polytheistic. Thank you. Took me a second. Yeah, most of them were polytheistic, and they worshipped multiple gods. Christianity, of course, typically focuses on worshiping one single god, but since Catholicism had the saint system where saints are revered, that was a lot easier for a lot of people to understand than just having one god to focus on. Musical influence is also very prevalent across the world. For example, Brazilian samba, Cuban and Dominican rumba, jazz, for those of you who are familiar with jazz, blues, rock and roll, soul, and hip-hop all owe their existence to African musical styles. Some of those you're probably all familiar with because of the Harlem Renaissance that we'll get to eventually, shows the influence of African musical styles. However, one thing we don't often give credit to Africans for are country, western, and bluegrass music. But many of these musical styles were actually also inspired by African string instruments that were brought over by slaves. So even country music owes a lot of its existence to the influence of African slaves. Finally, food like rice, jambalaya, and okra were all originally African foods that slaves brought over with them. So, just a few examples of how the African diaspora affected American culture. Now, why is it important to recognize that African slaves did impact American culture? Yeah, and I'll let you think on this one for your own for a second. Alright, That's enough, I think. One of the reasons I like to think that is so important is because oftentimes throughout history, we tend to depict African slaves and African Americans in general as sort of passive victims who really didn't have any impact on the world that they were in. However, studying the African diaspora shows that African Americans were not simply just passive victims. They did have an impact that we can see concrete evidence of all across the Americas and really all across the world. So it's important to recognize that many of the cultural things we hold dear to this day did owe a lot of their existence to the influence of African slaves who no one really would have given any credit to. So, that's all I have for you mainly today and for this week. Please do just remember again, you have these major assignments coming up, especially your first writing assignment, which again is due this Friday at 5 p.m. Please don't hesitate to check with me if you need any help with this. I'm even willing to run over some rough drafts and some thesis statements with you. That is absolutely no problem. Just please let me know if I can help with these in any way. In the meantime, have a great weekend, and I will speak to you all digitally again next week. Thank you.